Good morrow, nerds. It is I. I've talked about all manner of topics relating to tabletop RPGs on this channel, but I've never actually talked about what a tabletop RPG is. So, let's talk about it. What is a tabletop RPG? How do you get into the hobby, and why am I so obsessed with it? But before I go on a slightly more noob-friendly rant than usual, I have 3 buttons that I'd love it if you'd click, and those are like, subscribe, and the bell for notifications. So, what is a tabletop role-playing game? It should be a simple question, but the answer is surprisingly complex. At its most fundamental level, a tabletop RPG is just make-believe with rules tacked on. It's a group of people sitting around a table pretending to be other people. In the overwhelming majority of RPGs, there will be one game master, and then anywhere from 2 to 6 players. Each of these players has a single character. They make this character themselves, they name it, they give it an appearance, personality, all of that stuff. And they are responsible for playing it to the hilt. Especially in a long-form campaign, you get a lot of time to actually get into this character, to build it up and to explore it. And in addition to all of that roleplay stuff, you have a character sheet with a whole bunch of abilities on it, a whole bunch of rules that govern what it can and can't do, and how well it can do things. These characters are called player characters, or PCs. Then you have the Game Master. Not every game has a Game Master, but the ones that don't are pretty weird and niche. The Game Master, also called the Dungeon Master if you're specifically playing Dungeons & Dragons, is responsible for controlling literally everything else. They control the barkeeps, bandits, and bug monsters that your player characters will run across. They also control all of the world and setting elements, where the forests are, where the mountains are, where the cities are, what they look like, all of those things. And they are the ones responsible for adjudicating the game's rules. This combination of abilities effectively gives them absolute power. And so, as you can imagine, a lot of GMs act accordingly. Don't be scared though, the GM causing a little mischief with their mix of absolute power and absolutely no responsibility is all part of the fun. I could go into more detail here about things like stats or dice or how character abilities work. But for one thing, a lot of that stuff varies from system to system. And for another, it's often much easier to understand the people in an RPG and how they relate to each other than trying to get into all of the imaginary abstraction stuff. When it comes to what you actually do in a tabletop RPG, that can be quite varied. A good point of reference though is the sort of things that you get up to in a video game RPG, which very often is running around, fighting monsters, interacting with random people, solving puzzles, and just getting into mayhem. It should be noted, however, that tabletop RPGs and video game RPGs are quite different in how they accomplish these goals. Which is actually quite funny, as video game RPGs began in the late 1970s with a bunch of nerds with access to university mainframes but no access to friends, trying to find ways to play D&D with a computer. In a video game RPG, there's a big emphasis on things like mastery and repetition. A good example of this would be, say, a Souls-like game where you have to fight the same boss over and over and over to learn their moveset to the point where you can eventually defeat them. All of this is predicated on the ability to repeat a fight, usually through some flavor of game saving. However, in tabletop RPGs, there are no do-overs. Once you have played through an encounter, that is set in stone. Not that I've tried it, but I doubt it would be that fun to play through the same fight over and over and over until you get the result that you want. We'll get to this in a little bit, but the actual process of playing a tabletop RPG is much slower than playing a video game, so this simply isn't a good option. Another difference between tabletop RPGs and video games that I think really highlights how tabletop RPGs work is hard coding. In a video game, almost everything is hard-coded into the game itself. The game maps that you play on, the appearance and dialogues of the NPCs you encounter, the AI of the enemies in combat, all of that stuff has to be pre-built by a game designer. Now, there are twists on this, such as, say, procedural generation, where some element of the game, be it the game map, the loot that you find, or something else, may be randomized at the point that you're playing. But to randomize something, you need a game designer to make a randomizer. The rules of a video game RPG are pretty much set in stone. All of that is designed by designers, programmed by programmers, and then, unless you want to install mods, that's just how it's going to be when you're running through it as a player. Tabletop RPGs are very different. For one thing, because the rules are being interpreted by people and not by a computer, they tend to be much more fluid and open to interpretation. This also naturally opens the door to rules being tweaked here and changed there. a task that is usually undertaken by the game master. And indeed, it is often expected that sooner or later, the GM will change the rules, to the point where it's actively encouraged. A third point on the difference between tabletop RPGs and video games is story. Video games are often, quite rightly applauded for their ability to actually create an interactive story that you can take a much more personal relationship to. But tabletop RPGs take this to a whole other level. Since GMs have the ability to personalize campaigns for the players that end up being in their group, the characters that they make, you can have an even more personal relationship to what goes on in the game. And indeed, some more narrativist styles of play pretty much hinge on exploring a group of characters and their goals, and expect the GM to take a much more reactive role. But the final difference, which really explains why video game RPGs are incredibly popular, and tabletop RPGs, despite being older, rather niche, is the difficulty and weirdness of interacting with them. When you play a role-playing game, you need to roleplay, not in the click a dialogue button that fits whichever playthrough you're doing sense, but actually think and act like your character and express yourself accordingly. This can be an awkward, uncomfortable process for some people, although I promise, if you keep at it long enough, it will get easier and easier. The other thing is that since all of the rules are handled by people, usually the GM, you have to interface with the rules through speaking, which means you can only ever play at the rate of human speech. This is a much slower process. You have to negotiate back and forth with your GM to actually get anything done in the game. And if there are any maths calculations, any modifiers to your die rolls, you've got to do all of that yourself. I've talked a few times about things like dice, modifiers, stats. Let's actually get into some of those things now. The exact way that tabletop RPGs represent characters in the rules is extremely variable, but there are quite a few features that most RPGs have in common. Each character will have a number of stats, which represent vague categories of natural ability that they are high or low in. Things like strength, dexterity, charisma, which will have some sort of numerical scale to them. In D&D, that is traditionally from 3 to 18, with 10 being average. In Vampire the Masquerade, it's from 1 to 5, with 2 being average. And in Cyberpunk Red, stats are rated from 1 to 8, and they don't actually tell you what the average is, but if you reverse engineer the maths on it, it's about a 5. You can also have a varying number of stats for varying levels of granularity, from 6 in D&D, to 4 in the Alien RPG, to 10 in Cyberpunk Red. These are usually combined with skills in some way to represent more specific areas of learning, such as an athletic skill for running and climbing, a persuasion skill for persuading people, or more setting-specific activities like, say, magic in a fantasy game or hacking in a sci-fi game. And these are usually combined together in some way or other. But these numbers alone won't tell you whether your character actually succeeds or fails. They will simply influence the probability of that outcome. The way you figure out if your character succeeds or fails is very often through a die roll. Now, the dice that tabletop RPGs use can be rather weird. You're probably familiar with the standard cube-shaped 6-sided dice that are used in a lot of board games and things. And to be fair, there are some RPGs out there, like Alien, Over the Edge, Traveller, and many others, that do only use these dice. But a lot of RPGs also use other weird fun dice, known as the polyhedrals. So let's cover them quickly. Each of them is named with the letter D followed by the number of sides they have. So a D4 for a 4-sided die, a D6 for a 6-sided die, and a D20 for a 20-sided die. Now, in terms of some of these other dice, we have the D4, this single pyramid die. They're a bit tricky to read, but they do make good improvised weapons. For memory's sake, these are the single pyramid dice. Then we have the classic D6, the cube dice. You know what these are, they don't need explanation. Next up, we have the D8, or as I like to call them, the double pyramid dice. Following on, we have the D12, with its lovely little pentagonal faces. And then the D20, with lots of little triangles that almost make it into a ball. Now, some of you who are more experienced in RPGs and happen to have clicked on this video for the lulz will be wondering where the D10s are. Because yes, in addition to dice based off platonic solids that we just covered, there are also these abominations of geometry that RPG lovers call D10s. And when you roll a pair of them together in a very clever way, they become a D100. But getting back to our main point, when the GM wants to decide whether a character succeeds or fails at a given task, they will ask the player to roll whatever combination of dice the system calls for, and if the player rolls well, then they succeed, and if they roll badly, they fail. What you roll exactly can vary. In D&D, you roll 1d20, and add your stat plus skill proficiency. In Alien, you roll a number of 6-sided dice equal to your stat plus skill. And in Call of Cthulhu, you roll a d100 and you try to roll equal or under either your stat or your skill. Call of Cthulhu is actually one of those systems that almost never combines stats and skills together. Bear in mind, you don't use die rolls for everything in tabletop RPGs. Most GMs will let you do things like walking or saying hello without needing to roll dice for them. You also don't need to keep track of every single detail through the game mechanics. In 5 years of GMing, I've never once made my players keep track of their characters' bowel movements. Beyond the stats and skills and the dice that they roll to use them, characters may also have a number of special abilities. The exact number, complexity, and superhero-ness will really vary from system to system, but it's worth noting that they are there. These may be things like being able to cast spells, do extra abilities with your attacks in combat, or even just get fans of your music to go to bed with you. A lot of RPG abilities revolve around combat, and that's because RPGs themselves actually evolved from wargames. And indeed, it's where a lot of RPG terminology comes from. The gamemaster was the person who moderated a wargame in one of the more complex ones like, say, Kriegspiel. A campaign as a series of linked sessions came from the idea of, say, playing out the entire Napoleonic Wars through a series of wargames over a series of days. Hit points come from naval wargaming, where one hit point of your ship meant that it could survive one hit from a naval shell. But at least in the modern age, the reason that a lot of RPGs revolve so heavily around combat is that killing things is fun. Not every RPG revolves around combat though. Some of them are more geared towards, say, political intrigue, deep character exploration, stuff like that. But even these RPGs do have at least some rules for fisticuffs. So I've talked about what an RPG is, and who knows, maybe I've even got you excited. How do you get into it? Well, it's not that easy. In fact, I've often said that tabletop RPGs are the world's most difficult social activity. You need to get about a half dozen people to all synchronize their schedules every week. At least one of them has to learn all of the rules in a 300 to 400 page rulebook, as well as doing a whole bunch of prep before the session to make everything even happen. Yeah, it's not that easy. And there are a lot of players out there who just can't find a GM, a lot of GMs out there who just can't find players. But if you don't want to find yourself in that situation, here's what you do. Even if you want to play your games in person, the best place to find fellow RPG players is on the internet, in places like Facebook, Reddit, or Discord, in what are called LFG groups. LFG stands for either looking for game or looking for group, depending on who you ask. You go on there, you find people whose schedules line up with yours, you make a character, you learn the rules, and then you start having fun. You will though need to consider what game system you want to play, as this will affect A, what books you need, B, what rules you need to learn, and C, whether you can find a group at all. The tabletop RPG that you're most likely to have heard of is Dungeons & Dragons, and I've tried to speak about it as little as possible in this video, because I absolutely hate it. To be fair, the current edition, the 5th edition, which is actually the 11th edition, but let's not get into that. That current edition is, to be fair, the first system that I ever played and GM'd, and for that purpose, it was perfectly serviceable. It does, to its credit, attract a very large community, which means if you want to find players or groups, you'll have a better chance with D&D than you will with any other system. However, what you'll find pretty quickly is that the rules of D&D are a mess. There are complicated rules exceptions to keep track of. The rules themselves are long, fiddly, and badly worded. I really don't recommend D&D unless someone is putting a gun to your head, and even then I still might ask them to pull the trigger. There is a decent set of other games though that do have enough players that you will find someone if you look hard enough for them, such as my current system of choice, Cyberpunk Red. If you're familiar with Cyberpunk 2077 or the Edge Runners anime, this game is set in the same universe but about 30 years earlier, and it's basically Cyberpunk meets the Wild West. It's a relatively rules-light system, and I would say it's reasonably easy for noobs to get into. Certainly, I've used it to introduce multiple players who had never played an RPG before, and they learn the rules fine. Other options are things like Call of Cthulhu or Pathfinder. These are games I'm not huge fans of personally, but they do have large followings, and if you either feel like variously D&D but not D&D, or dying and going insane in the world of H.P. Lovecraft, then I suggest you give these games a look. There's also a pretty wide array of games that are based off existing IPs, like Star Wars, Warhammer 40k, the Alien films, and many, many others. But if you're now rushing out to find all of the books and dice you'll need, I honestly wouldn't worry too much if you're a player. If you're a GM, you have a whole bunch of worrying to do. In fact, I have an entire half-hour long video about everything you need to worry about. But for a player, nobody expects you to know the rules or even own the books when you first start playing. You will need to do both eventually, but in those first couple of sessions, the GM will teach you all the rules you need to know as soon as you need to know them. Honestly, all you really need to bring is a reliable schedule and some enthusiasm. But having talked you through all of this, why would anyone go to the bother of playing an RPG? Video games exist, board games exist, and both of them provide a significantly more polished experience than even the best designed of tabletop RPGs. And the reason is that there's nothing else in the world like it. Yes, board game nights do have the same social aspect that tabletop RPGs do. You're getting to do something fun with your friends every week. Who wouldn't enjoy that? Video game RPGs give you plenty of options to, make and design your own character and to take ownership of them. But in a tabletop RPG, you inhabit them in a very different way. To really get the most out of an RPG, you really need to try thinking and acting to the best of your abilities like your character. It's a tough thing to do, but when you do it, it really is intoxicating. The atmosphere that you feel when you're sat around with your friends, rolling dice, laughing, all the while trying to make your dumb elf character in some way serious. There is nothing else like it. You never quite know what's going to happen, but you can always be pretty sure that it will be something interesting. Compared to, say, a book or a film, tabletop RPG stories are very chaotic and meandering, due to the whole rolling dice for everything, lack of any sort of editing or do-overs, and most importantly of all, the fact that these games are played by a bunch of chaotic people with different interests, all smashing their goals together to see what happens. But you know what? The stories and the experiences you get out of tabletop RPGs are incredibly personal, and often incredibly hilarious. And to me personally, there's very little else that can create those sort of experiences with that regularity and that intensity. It's a bit awkward, it's extremely dumb, and it's near as damn it impossible to explain to anyone who hasn't played an RPG. But there's a reason that I'm so obsessed with these things. I started playing RPGs back in October 2018, and I became a game master for the first time 3 months later. And since then, I've been playing tabletop RPGs pretty much non-stop, mostly as a game master, but very often as a player too. As much as tabletop RPGs are one of the most difficult, time-consuming hobbies that I could possibly have chosen, I wouldn't have it any other way. And you know what? I hope you give them a try, and I hope you experience this for yourself. And with that, it's a wrap. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then please like it, share it with your friends, and leave a comment down below. If you'd like to see more videos like tabletop RPGs, usually aimed at more advanced players and GMs, then please subscribe and hit the bell for notifications. It really does help the channel. And once more, thank you all so much for watching, and until I see you next, farewell.